guys, it's finally spring, which means it's plantar fasciitis season. We're going to see a big jump in folks with plantar fasciitis and shin splints and stress fractures as the weather changes and we get outside, and as track season gets into full swing and we move from indoor track meets to outdoor track meets, and track clubs pick up. So I wanted to reach out and post a video about things you need to look for if shin splints, plantar fasciitis, stress fractures are happening, and if they're not going away with traditional treatments. So let's talk about all of those things. So the reason we see an increased incidence of stress fractures, plantar fasciitis, and shin splints when we transition from winter to spring is how we train indoors compared to outdoors. Treadmills are wonderful things. They keep us active when the weather is gross, but it's a change in your running form. When I run on a treadmill, the belt moves for me. So all my body has to do is keep up with the speed of the belt, and I don't have to absorb as much shock through my foot, and I don't have to work as hard to propel myself. So it's a way to run, but it's a different way to run. The other thing we see in running on a treadmill is we're more hip flexor biased, meaning my brain can sense the surrounding of the treadmill and I'm running in a box. And so when I'm running in a box, I tend to run more hip forward and less drive through my hip, and so my running form is different. When I move to outside, I have to absorb, my foot has to absorb the shock of my body weight, which depending on the study you look at is 10 to 12 times your body weight with every single step. So I go from treadmill where the belt was moving for me and I had a little more shock absorption to outside, unlevel surface, concrete sidewalk, grass, whatever. Now I'm having to absorb 10 to 12 times my body weight on an altered surface, and I'm having to propel myself versus the belt doing that for me. The other thing we look at is running form changes. Once I get outside, if I've been inside on a treadmill, I tend to run more up and down because, again, my brain perceives the box of the treadmill. Once I get outside, I don't have that box, and so if I still run more up and down, that's greater force compression through your foot and ankle instead of pushing through and using more hip to run. And so running outside can be less stressful because I can open up my arm swing, I can open up my hip drive, but if you don't actively make the transition in your running form, your body will still run short and straight up and down, and that can create more compression or more shock absorption through your foot and ankle. So if we look at what can happen and why do I get stress fractures, shin splints, plantar fasciitis, a lot of times underlying it can be a pelvic dysfunction or a tibial glide dysfunction. So my foot is incredibly important to life function. This has got to move well. If it doesn't move well, the rest of the chain can be affected. So your foot, your knee, and your hip are really good friends. Your foot and your pelvis or hip are best friends, and your knee is often this joint caught in the middle. So we really have to respect what's going on, knee, hip, and foot, and all three things need to function very well for me to be able to run and be outside and be active in track, cross country, running for recreation, whatever. So whatever happened to me during the winter, we need to respect as we start to go outside in the spring. So if we look at foot as a general rule, as I run, and this guy's a little more flexible than we want to see, as I run and my foot hits the ground, my heel rolls in, so I collapse here, and my forefoot moves in the opposite direction, okay? So my foot, it's basically like I'm wringing out a towel. The back side goes one way, the front side goes the other way. These two are constantly twisting in opposite directions. If I have spent the winter in boots, high heels, restricted shoes, basketball shoes that are high tops, shoes with really rigid bottoms, I don't get as much of this interplay, and so that will affect my shock absorption. If I have had any ankle sprains over the winter, I lose that hind foot mobility, and that will affect the shock absorption of my foot. So I can have a mid-tarsal joint, so front side of my foot dysfunction, or a hind foot, meaning this can't rotate, and then I'm losing shock absorption, and that's going to put more stress on my plantar fascia or on my tibia, either the soft tissue causing a stress response like shin splints, or bony impact, and I end up with a stress fracture. If we move higher up the chain and we look at your knee, so if I've had patellar tendonitis from jumping in basketball, knee pain, meniscus surgery, a meniscus tear, anytime my brain hurts, I try to stop motion at that spot. So if you've had some knee soreness, your body says, hey knee, I don't want to move. You still walk, you still squat, you still function, so something else has to move more. So that can result in my foot trying to move more, my hip trying to move more to make up for the lack of knee motion. Or my brain says, oh my gosh, this really hurts, I want to shut down all motion. So then my ankle locks up a little bit to prevent rotation and glide at my knee, because what happens is when my foot is doing its funky thing for absorbing shock, my shin bone also has to rotate. Okay, so when my shin bone rotates to absorb shock, my shin bone's connected to my knee. So that makes up the bottom half of my knee. So if my knee says I hurt and I don't want to rotate, my foot will lock up and my foot won't rotate. So if I've had knee pain, oftentimes what we see, and even hip pain and back pain, what we see is a loss of glide from that tibia or that shin bone on that foot. So if I lose my glide here, guess what? If this can't glide freely, what does this need to do to run? This needs to glide freely. Okay, if this locks up because my knee has hurt, my hip has hurt, I have a history of ankle sprains, whatever, and I lose that shin bone glide, that creates excessive stress at my plantar fascia and excessive impact stress at my shin bone, which can result in shin splints or stress fractures. If we move up even higher, we go to pelvis and hip. So same thing, if you've had some hip pain, labral type pain, so groin pain, hip flexor pain, trochanteric bursitis pain, so pain in the outside of your hip, low back pain, again, my brain experiences pain and says, I don't want to hurt. If you move me more, I'm going to hurt. So I'm going to lock up or tighten up to not hurt. So my hip doesn't move. If my hip doesn't move well, that lack of motion gets translated all the way down and I don't absorb shock, or my hip tries to compensate to find a path of less pain. So when I do that sometimes, here's my pelvis, here's my hip, if there is pain through here, what can happen in that pelvis is my pelvis can rotate forward or rotate backwards to try to find a path of least resistance to have less pain while I'm doing whatever the function is. If you have single-sided back pain, so SI joint pain, 9 times out of 10, we have a pelvic rotation. Okay, so if I've had some back pain over the winter and it just went away, your body most likely rotated forward or rotated back and is now tightened up and locked down. The problem is with this pelvic rotation, nothing happens in the body without consequence someplace else. So if I have a pelvic rotation here, that translates through the leg and creates a functional leg length discrepancy. That means one leg is longer than the other leg because of this rotation at the hip. So we have soft tissue changes, we have joint changes because of that pelvic rotation. And what happens at the foot is the foot tries to make up for that. So if my pelvis rotates and that leg is longer, my body will stiffen up through this part of your foot and rotate out and become a little more rigid to try to become taller to keep me even, because your brain's job is to keep your eyes in the middle of your body. We like symmetry. So on the short leg, I have a more rigid foot. Okay, if it's the reverse and it's a long leg, then my body will try to collapse that foot a little bit more to make up for the length. So I either have a rigid foot to land on, or I have a foot that's being driven into the ground harder. Both things can result in plantar fasciitis, shin pain, knee pain, hip pain, back pain, all because your body tried to compensate from an earlier trauma, an earlier injury, a position that you got stuck in that it tried to figure out how to manage. So if we look at spring and we're getting outside and we're moving on unlevel surfaces more, grass, inclines, I'm having to absorb all of that shock and I'm not used to it, we can see those injuries start to occur. And if you're just working on everything you find on the internet, I'm stretching, I'm icing, I'm changing my shoes, and nothing is helping, we need to look further at, am I gliding and moving appropriately at my mid-tarsal joint, my tibial joint? Is my pelvis aligned correctly? Does my hip move efficiently? Does my knee move efficiently? Does my spine move efficiently? Is my pelvis in the right position? There are a lot of things we can look at. So all hope is not lost. You just need further assessment. So hope that helped. Let me know if you have any questions. Happy running.